Have you ever seen this billboard or something like it? You may be having the reaction that I did when I first saw it. Wow, someone spent a lot of money on something they don't like. That's unusual, right? Anyway. But no, seriously. Does it matter if religions are fairy tales? Are religions fairy tales? In other words, are they just stories? And I want to suggest to you that someone like Meister Eckhart actually has something interesting to say about this, but he's not going to answer it in the way that you might think, which is typical of Eckhart. And I want to get into this by talking about not just religion as stories, but what may be even worse, religion as projection. Because stories, in some sense, and the way that we take in stories and interpret them is by way of a kind of projection. In other words, we are projecting our own desires and selves outward onto the world, into the stories, into the characters, identifying with pieces of them and enjoying it therein. And so if religion is projection, that also makes it subjective. That also makes it something that depends upon our way of understanding ourselves and understanding the world. And so are we projecting our desires into religion? In other words, is religion a kind of wish fulfillment, which is what we heard, especially in the 19th century? Or is it even more so, more thoroughgoing than that, where we are projecting ourselves into religious material? In other words, we are injecting what it is that means to be human for us and how we understand the world into our understanding of the religious stories. That would mean that religion is serving as a kind of mirror for us, and we are able to see ourselves in the religious text, which, by the way, may not be a bad thing at all. So, love it or hate it, the billboard tells us something interesting about religion and has something interesting to tell us today about religion, which is this is something that people don't like. In other words, there is a growing body of people that don't like the idea of a Tertullian-like absolute faith. In other words, a faith that is completely unquestioning, especially in historical facts, so-called literalism. In other words, people tend not to believe or to find it believable that there was a historical whatever, resurrection, incarnation, virgin birth, miracles, any of that kind of thing. People find that kind of thing increasingly hard to believe, and so they're rejecting religion likewise. And this is an indication of that this is someone angrily saying, more or less, that, by the way, what it is that you think about religion is just a fairy tale, as if that somehow undercuts it. Now, that's the key. Does it undercut it? In other words, if it was the case that religions are just stories, just fairy tales, does that damage religion? Well, it depends upon what you think religion is. And so it at least attacks a certain level of religious understanding and maybe even a kind of caricature of what religion is, which is interesting because in that way, it makes it similar to what people like the Four Horsemen, the Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and people like that of the world are saying about religion because they are attacking a certain form of it. So let's dive into this a little bit because we get answers not only from someone like Meister Eckhart in a surprising way, but also from Cyprian Smith, who is a Benedictine monk, a modern day Benedictine monk who has written on Meister Eckhart, all the way back to Origen of Alexandria in the 2nd century after Christ, a Christian theologian, and then with an allusion as well to someone like Augustine. Well, this is a pretty good group, I would say, in terms of pedigree for being within Christianity, for being within received religion, and then still talking about religion as projection and immature forms of it. So let's dive in with this. Now, Cyprian Smith says, in Eckhart's sermons, in his sermons, he talks about God in such a way as to shock us into an awareness of how shallow and inadequate our habitual notions of God are. Well, that entire sentiment assumes that there are perfectly inadequate and immature sentiments about what God is, but this is made more explicit. So he's going to go on to say, and this is perhaps the key passage from that same work from Smith, there have to be projections in the beginning of our lives. Without them, the spiritual life cannot get started. At first, one's notion of God is distorted by our personal needs and emotions. Projection. It takes time for all that to be refined and purified. And ultimately, what he has in mind heads in the direction of a further punch, which is this: theology, liturgy, church hierarchy, and pastoral works. These are ultimately only means and instruments. They're just tools. They are not God himself. Okay, so now you see here we're kind of peeling back the onion. And so the immature forms are going to relate to things that are not God himself, but are indeed external works, practices, liturgy, hierarchy, all of these sorts of things, and potentially also including dogma. And this is what Eckhart is going to do with the situation as well. And so Eckhart will take this same kind of sentiment from Smith and point to, yeah, okay, there are immature forms of spiritual knowing. And by the way, this is not a recent idea. This is an idea that goes back even in Eckhart's time, 1,000 years. And so we hear him say, for instance, recalling Augustine, "In the beginning, Scripture laughs at young children and attracts a child to it. So there is no one so simple-minded that he cannot find what suits him in it." Okay, so if that wasn't clear enough for you, we have an additional passage where he makes this very clear. Moses only wrote like that. He knew better, but he did it for people who could not grasp otherwise. That's actually from Sermon 101, which is the Christmas sermon that I've been discussing in a number of different videos recently. And so a Christmas sermon, he's talking about these details of dogma, historical pieces and articles of faith, and saying, you know, Moses, he only wrote like that. He knew better. In other words, there was a kind of secret teaching. There was something beyond in terms of his experience and his understanding, his spiritual maturity that led him beyond that. But he did it for people who could not grasp otherwise. Okay, let's take all of these pieces together now. From Eckhart, from Origen, from Augustine, from Cyprian Smith, and put it together. What we have is a cohesive whole where we can see, okay, look, this is not a new thing. It points to the difference between exotericism and esotericism. In other words, exotericism, which is available to everyone, and esotericism, which is something that you have to be part of the in-group. In other words, you have to have experience to be able to actually see for yourself, which is a big deal in Eckhart that I've addressed elsewhere. And so all of these things speak to a kind of spiritual maturity, a process of maturity whereby you begin with, as Smith says, you begin with these projections. You begin by projecting your own desires and what it is, especially at the intellectual maturity, the developmental maturity of a child, such that you're not going to be able to understand mysticism and all of the richness of theology and everything with religion. And so you begin with projections in the same way that a child begins by having a certain very immature understanding of certain adult topics. I mean, think of something totally different like marriage or even worse, perhaps, sexuality, something that they cannot possibly identify with until a certain point in their lives. And so you have these not only inchoate forms of understanding, but in some cases, forms that are just downright wrong. I mean, things that are very clearly wrong, but we have to try and wrap our minds around it in some way. And we have to understand religion because we don't have any other choice. We have to understand it in terms that we can understand. In other words, we have to understand it in terms of our own experience and whatever our level of intellectual maturity is at the time. If you haven't seen it, you haven't seen it. And so you can't really be there and know what's going on. What is it like to be a professional baseball player? Ultimately, I don't know. I've never been one. I've never had that kind of expertise. I can't speak to what it's like to have that kind of intuition, but I can try to get into it by way of certain metaphors, by way of certain similarities, and this tends to be the way that we think. A child is going to do so very simply, very plainly in terms of, okay, big brother in a toga sitting up on a hill, and that's the sort of understanding of God. And you hear about this in elementary schools with children who are actually talking religion with each other. I don't know if you've paid much attention to this, but it's very interesting where you have children taking dogma from home and talking to other children about it. Do you believe this? And it could be, do you believe in Jesus or do you believe in Santa Claus? And you have the other kids going back and forth and trading things, and watching the way that their minds work with that is very interesting, because we're still very clearly dealing with a stage of projection. We're dealing with a spiritually immature stage that we know that we're going to go beyond. The discomfort with all of this comes when you have adults that have forms of spiritual maturity that may themselves not be all that terribly mature. And this is something that is likened, at least I think, and especially something that Richard Dawkins or Hitchens or any of the others could understand, because they all have their specialties. Dawkins is in evolutionary biology. So it's very easy for us to say, okay, think about your average adult and their view on evolutionary biology. It's pretty immature. And in many cases, it's probably pretty wrong. And so I don't think someone like Dawkins would have any difficulty seeing that, yeah, okay, your average adult doesn't understand this, and their form of misunderstanding is properly analogous to the same kind of misunderstanding that we get with someone who is a child thinking about religion. Now, of course, Dawkins may respond in saying, okay, well, look, that means that a lot of adults are very childish with religion. Eckhart is not going to fight that as much as you might imagine, and I'm not sure that it can be fought as much as you might imagine, because your average person's view on philosophy and religion and genetics and evolutionary biology and almost anything is not necessarily the best. The question is whether or not that form is completely different than the mature form. When I mentioned a baseball player, the reason that I chose this example is because, I played baseball for a long time. I wasn't that good, but I played it for a long time. And so what is it like for someone to actually be a pro baseball player? Well, I know what it's like to play baseball. And I simply then have to try and imagine, what is it like to be substantially better at that, where my intuitions accord a certain level of habit and functioning that is much, much higher, is much faster, more accurate, more expertly in its execution. Well, I do that with driving to some degree. I'm not a very good driver, but nevertheless, I have a lot of practice. I have a lot of practice being a bad driver. And so, I have a well-honed expertise there. So I know what it's like to have a well-honed physical expertise. And I can transfer that by way of metaphor into baseball and say, they probably have something kind of like that. They've worked the 10,000 hours, et cetera, with a nod to, one of my friends at Florida State, and who was a student of his. And anyway, so I can sort of imagine what that's like and put myself in that position. But with religion, the thing that we consistently hear from Eckhart, from the mystics, and from others is that it is completely different, that it is not the same. It is different in kind from anything that you have ever experienced before. So it is not similar to anything that you've ever experienced before. Well, if that's the case, then unfortunately, the conclusion has to be that, yeah, all of those other forms are more childlike. And so when we then return to the idea of, okay, are all religions fairy tales? In other words, do people frequently, even as adults, have a very immature form of what religion is, an immature vision and understanding of what religion is? Eckhart can't say no, and he is a esoteric when it comes to Christianity, and it's not clear that the others in the Christian tradition are going to be able to say no to that either. It's more along the lines of, well, that stage can be useful, and we have to minister to people who are at that stage. I think that tends to be the approach, while kind of pushing aside the issue of, well, that version of truth and that version of what you think things really are like, wait and see. Taste the wine for yourself, as Eckhart might say, and then let me know what you think. And that tends to be the approach. That's also, by the way, what we get in Buddhism, with people saying that, okay, you begin with all these projections and all these kind of very simplistic versions of gods and goddesses and reincarnation and all of this. Taste and see. Experience it for yourself and see, and then you won't have to worry about all these things. And oh, by the way, you'll also see why it is that you were just totally out to lunch in terms of your view on what Buddhism was about, what enlightenment was about. You had no idea whatsoever. Once you taste it, then things become clear and different in a way that is distinctly esoteric, that is distinctly different in kind. And so, does this answer the question? Kind of. It's probably not what you were looking for, but it may be useful. So even if it's not what you're looking for, maybe it's what you need. I don't know. I hope it's useful to you. I hope it's good to think with. I hope it's fun, at least.